3 minutes after 10 is the time, and such is the nature of this job, and particularly this subject matter, that I'm never 100% sure what angle I'm going to take until I actually start talking. I've already changed my mind from the last time you heard my voice, if you were still listening, just before the 10 o'clock news. I think that what interests me most this morning is not really the question of what's changed. That's too nebulous, and I've got a horrible feeling that the answer might be nothing. And I don't know how fruitful it would be to explore that particular territory. But as we survey the situation 1 year on from the October the 7th terror attack, I think that the worst atrocity committed against Jewish people since the Holocaust, I mean, whatever has happened since, it is absolutely crucial to remember the context of that dreadful day, of that event. Whatever we might think has changed, the key question surely is how it's going to end. Let me show you what I mean, okay? Let me show you what I mean. Benjamin Netanyahu has urged Western allies to stand behind Israel or risk strengthening Iran's axis of evil on the anniversary of the October the 7th attacks. And yet, on the same day, the United Nations refugee chief has said that airstrikes in Lebanon have already violated humanitarian law. So what is Benjamin Netanyahu asking us to stand behind? This is the UN refugee peace. Filippo Grandi said yesterday that airstrikes in Lebanon had violated international humanitarian law by hitting civilian infrastructure and killing civilians. I mean, one quick comparison, if such things matter, is the number of children killed in Gaza dwarfs the number of children killed in Ukraine, for example, by Russia. But there are other stories around today as well. The father of one hostage still held in Gaza, has described being pelted by eggs and verbally abused while protesting outside an event being attended by Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Right-wing activists shouted at him, "You've made enough noise, be quiet. You are cancer in the country." Another accused him of being funded by Hamas. Families of hostages still held have described a shift in mood, perhaps a lessening, well, certainly in this case, a lessening of concern or sympathy. And then another very troubling story, which probably needs a little bit more analysis than some of the coverage allows, but reports that 1 in 10 or 10% of children polled, 18 to 24-year-olds, young people polled in this country, have expressed some sympathy for Hamas. They can be a fairly binary bunch, can't they, young people? I certainly was very binary when I was young. But if you were to charge them with explaining why killing in one direction is metaphysically, is philosophically different from killing in another direction, you can see why they might struggle. But sympathy for a prescribed terrorist organisation is a complication for many people, a complication too far. And that's just off the top of my head. I'm sure there are other stories around today that will add to the sense of confusion, contradiction, and conflict. So we've got a UN chief accusing Israel of already violating humanitarian law in Lebanon. Of course, Hezbollah had nothing to do with the October the 7th Hamas attacks in Israel. You've got Benjamin Netanyahu saying that the West must support them, even as the death toll, it's been in the tens of thousands for a long time now. You've got the father of a hostage still held, describing a change in mood and being pelted with eggs and abused by supporters of Benjamin Netanyahu, who is supposed to be, of course, prioritizing the safety of hostages, or at least used to claim to be prioritizing the safety of hostages above all else. More than 2,000 people have been killed in Lebanon in the past month, as the focus switched from the Hezbollah-controlled south to the capital of Lebanon. I've also got an interview for you later with the son, an amazing man. I've met some incredible people in the course of doing this job, but this is certainly up there with the very best. And he lost his parents that day. He has some extraordinary messages to share with us. And we'll hear that probably later this hour. But here's the question. How's it going to end? I mean, what would you have said if I'd asked you that question a year ago? If I'd said to you a year ago, how's it going to end? What would you have said? I think I would have said the IDF is going to go into Gaza. It is going to bring down hell upon the people there in pursuit of Hamas. I was never clear on how you could both undertake a truly bloody campaign on the ground in Gaza while also prioritising the safety of hostages. But it felt inappropriate to point that out, at least at the very beginning. It felt indelicate, didn't it? Insensitive to say, hang on a minute, if they're killing this many civilians, they're not exactly being careful, so how can they be prioritising the safety of the hostages at the same time? So I think if you had forced me to clarify, I'd have said I think a lot of hostages are going to die as well, whether as a consequence of the Israeli attacks or at the hands of panicking terrorists. But there will be a point at which Israel feels that it has sated the need for retaliation, response, or revenge. And you choose either one of those R words, or indeed all three of them, according to your perspective. How is it going to end? It's going to end with a death toll in Gaza in the thousands. So let's say 4 times more deaths in Gaza than Hamas managed to inflict upon Jewish people on October the 7th. I'd have gone 4 or 5 times, cautiously, I think. And then they will return to this unbearable stalemate, which suits only the purposes of people who are opposed to a 2-state solution. That includes people in the Israeli cabinet, in the Israeli government, more perhaps in senior Israeli government roles than at any other point in living memory. And of course, it includes terror groups like Hamas and Hezbollah. Anybody opposed to the 2-state solution essentially benefits from the sustaining of the status quo. So if you'd asked me a year ago, how is it going to end? I think I would have said that. And my God, I would have been wrong. There's 2,000 people dead in Lebanon now, in the last month alone. Well in excess of 40,000 dead in Gaza, and almost certainly many, many, many more of that. But I will still get messages today saying that you can't trust those figures because it's the Hamas-controlled health authorities. Literally nobody honest thinks the final figure is going to be lower than what is currently being released, least of all the Israeli authorities. But if you are clinging to something, I know not what, then you are going to be clinging more tightly than ever. So if you'd asked me 12 months ago how I thought it was going to end, I think that's what I would have said, that we will lurch back, we will swing back to this profoundly unsatisfying status quo where people in Israel live under the threat of missiles and have to retreat fairly regularly to shelters, while people in Gaza live in what is essentially the largest refugee camp in the history of humanity. The occupied territories will remain occupied, and until they are not occupied, the prospect of progress or an unlocking of the most constipated historical tension of our time is impossible. But here we are a year later, where Gaza is still under almost constant attack, and the provocations of Hezbollah have brought down upon the people of Lebanon more ordnance, more missiles, to the point where I think 2,000 people are dead now. A quick word. Today's not the day for Idiot's Corner. Obviously, it's far too serious. But Lawrence has been in touch to say Israel goes out of their way to avoid civilian casualties. And again, a year ago, I would have read that out with seriousness and with a profundity. Israel goes out of its way. No, Israel says that they go out of their way to avoid civilian casualties. I don't think anybody objective still believes that. And if you believed it in Gaza a year ago, as we waited to see what would happen next, then I'm afraid if you still believe it today, you are lying to yourself. A refugee chief of United Nations already talking about breaches of humanitarian law with the bombardment of civilian infrastructure and the killing of civilians there. So, I mean, in the highly unlikely event that anyone still believes that Israel is careful to avoid killing civilians, they're not doing a very good job. So it's either dishonesty or epic incompetence, Lawrence. I'll leave you to decide which one it is. And that question then of how does it end becomes, well, imagine if it is still the case that things swing back to where they were this time last year or on October the 6th of last year. The illegally occupied territories are still occupied. The terrorist organizations in Gaza and in Lebanon retain their sort of stranglehold upon the windpipes of the population, many of whom would happily see the back of them. The missiles continue to fly into Israel, and the responses continue to, well, it's sort of punctuated with bloody responses and bloody retaliation. The people in Gaza remain essentially imprisoned, and we just wait to see what the next flare-up is going to be. Those are your choices. Those are your choices. Either we will see a swing back to the status quo, or something profound is going to change. And if it's a swing back to the status quo, then for what have all these people died? 034560600973. And if it is a profound and permanent shift in the situation, then what does that profound and permanent shift look like? So there are two ways into this. The first is the overview, the informed analysis of what the end game looks like. And I don't think anyone would describe the end game at this point as the conclusion, the ultimate conclusion. I just don't see it. Maybe you do, in which case 034560600973. And the second way into it, of course, is the sort of about the personal shifts in understanding and opinion. I was going to open this hour by asking what's changed. And in some ways it's the same question, because the answer might be nothing, except, of course, the number of lives ended, the number of people injured, the number of buildings blown to smithereens, the amount of territory rendered uninhabitable, the trauma suffered by people coming under fire from Hezbollah or Hamas rockets, the dead school children, the dead Druze school children playing football, being bombed by Hezbollah. I mean, the changes for those families are immeasurable, impossible to compute. But for the world, for the people still alive, what's changed? I don't know. So here's the number, 034560600973 is the number that you need. Benjamin Netanyahu warns that unless the West remains in lockstep behind Israel, then Iran's axis of evil will be strengthened. The refugee chief of the United Nations warns that Israel is already committing humanitarian crimes in Lebanon. The International Criminal Court remains committed to the arrest of, I haven't checked whether the Hamas leaders on their list are still alive or not, but members of the Israeli cabinet up to and including Benjamin Netanyahu certainly are. 12 months in, airstrikes carried out on a mosque in the center of Gaza yesterday. So 12 months effectively of killing, death and bombardment in Gaza. And the question, I mean, I think the times are right as Israeli troops continue to fight Hamas a far longer war than anyone expected when retaliation began for the attacks of October the 7th. I wonder how you think it is going to end. And that is a really horrible question. Because if it ends with a return to the tense status quo, then what the hell has been achieved? 034560600973. Hit the numbers now, you will get through. It's 18 minutes after 10. How do you think it's going to end, and what has changed? You can come at that, of course, from any angle that you want. 20 minutes after 10 is the time, and I suppose what has changed is a slightly more palatable question than what has been achieved in terms of what has been achieved. Aya wants me to ask that question. What has Israel achieved in the last year? What has the IDF accomplished? Well, in military terms, a hell of a lot would be the short answer. A hell of a lot of people dead, a hell of a lot of buildings destroyed. But I think you're looking for something a little bit more substantive than that, morally or ethically or even tactically substantive than that. And I'm afraid I wouldn't know the answer. 21 minutes after 10 is the time. How would it end? What does the end look like? Or even the sort of semi-permanent pause? David's in Sutton to kick things off. David, what would you like to say?
Hi there. I was listening to you, and I just think how it will end, I don't know. Like you say, I don't think a two-state solution is going to work as it once did. Not that it worked very well in the first place.
Well, I think that's the only way it ends permanently. Personally, I didn't mean to give the impression I thought that was off the table. I just mean that as long as the leaders of Hamas, Hezbollah, and Israel are opposed to a two-state solution, then it ain't going to happen anytime soon. No,
and you're right. I mean, how it could end in a sort of immediate way, in terms of achieving some sort of peace, would be if America and Britain stop funding Israel, stop giving them arms.
Well, then what happens?
They might take notice, and
but then what happens on the ground?
Might pull back a bit.
What happens on the ground?
Well, it's not going to be good. But
what do you mean? I don't know. I'm not. It's not a trick question. I genuinely don't know. So Israel's military capability would remain pretty strong, I think, in the short term. It's always odd, isn't it, to hear John Healey today calling for peace, calling for a ceasefire, and we're still sending jet parts to Israel, albeit that they've gone a lot further than the previous administration in withdrawing arms licenses. But do we know what would happen if America turned off the tap?
I think.
They'd run out. They'd run out of missiles eventually,
on Israel, wouldn't they?
Yeah, well, they'd run out of missiles eventually. So
yeah, they would.
And does that not play into the hands of the terrorists?
Well, something needs to be achieved. There needs to be negotiations on both sides, which hasn't happened. But we're in this stalemate where thousands upon thousands of people are being slaughtered. In Gaza, 42,000, mostly women and children. But I don't. Hamas, Hezbollah are terrorist organisations. October the 7th was an atrocity. But, the response has been completely disproportionate.
And that's where I think the question of what's changed in the course of the last year overtakes the question of how is it going to end. 1 in 10 of those aged 18 to 24 have a favourable view of Hamas. I would bet my bottom dollar that was not the case this time last year. So in the course of the year, somehow, and support for, or sympathy, it's a big difference between sympathy and support, but not that big. Sympathy for Hamas among young people in this country has increased. David, thank you. Hassan is in Bath. Hassan, what would you like to say?
Hi, I just wanted to talk about how such a big wave of pessimism has somewhat overcome many young people and many people across the entire globe. I'd like to think, obviously I can't speak for themselves, but it almost seems as if there cannot be any winners when it comes to this because of the lives that have already been lost.
Yeah. So whatever the result, the price is too high.
The price is exactly too high. And even if we do go to a two-state solution, right, what stops an Israeli expansionist minister who gains into power and then invades a sovereign Palestinian state in the process?
Or vice versa.
Or
vice versa. What stops a Palestinian sovereign state with the support of Iran or Egypt or Syria having territorial ambitions in Israel as well?
You're completely right, and the only thing that's going to happen is more and more people's sons and daughters' lives are going to get lost, and I don't really see an end conclusion, because if we do integrate Palestine into a greater Israeli state, what stops them becoming second-class citizens there? So whichever way and angle you look at it, it's just going to cause further polarization because with no negotiation process, with no conflict resolution, you're just going to end up in a situation in which I think the statistic that you listed, 1 in 10 young people, I'm a young person myself, support Hamas, which is crazy.
Well, they express sympathy. They express sympathy and support.
Oh, okay.
And support. And support. And language is important, but the idea that they think Hamas is, in a sense, representing resistance is not that hard to understand, really, is it? In the context of what some people are seeing over the course of the last year. I mean, the idea that you support what happened on October the 7th, to me, is hideous, and I'm sure you don't.
Exactly, it is. It is, but then supporting the obstructive Israeli retaliation to October 7th, and the masses of misery and that's caused, it almost feels as if there can't be any winners, James, and it's just going to be more and more people of my age who are going to be dying on battlefields. It's not the Israeli ministers that are sending out their own kids. It's not Palestinian
some of them
generals
will
sending
be.
out their
I mean,
own
there's
kids.
conscription in Israel, actually, mate. Not to split hairs. So I don't think anybody except some of the most orthodox sections of society are exempt from national service. So their own children will be going to war. Netanyahu, I think he lost a brother. So it's simply not right to say that it's a kind of scenario where they send other people's children to die. But I don't know how relevant that is to your central point. And that I mean, leads us to the question of what has been achieved, to which your answer is nothing, and quite the opposite, in fact. Everything has got worse.
Bringing pessimism and a lot of pain to many, many people.
Could Israel have done anything differently? I mean, did I sound ridiculous to you when I suggested that a year ago, if you'd really sort of forced my hand, I'd have said I think they'll kill 4 or 5 times as many people in Gaza as Hamas have killed in Israel? I don't think they'll be particularly concerned about how many civilians die, and I don't think that support at home will be for Netanyahu will be diluted by civilian deaths. But if you told me that the figures were going to go north of 20, 30, 40,000, I don't think I would have believed you.
No, and I don't think I would have either, because it goes back to the age-old security dilemma, doesn't it? Hamas has done this one thing. Okay, well, we've got to show them that we're still strong and we're still going to be protecting the people within our own borders. But I'm not sure anybody was expecting.
So nobody
a genocide.
No, well, you say genocide. That's moot at the point. Although the definition of ethnic cleansing has certainly come close, has come within reach, but. Do you think anybody knows whether they support him or not when Benjamin Netanyahu might say enough is enough?
I really don't know, and I don't think, because when both sides in this conflict believe that they are acting legitimately, it goes down to religious grounds, it goes down to, what's done in the Oslo Accords and what have you, every side in this think they're legitimate, and that's why there can't be any conflict resolution when it comes to this.
That's why the question today is as you quite rightly keep repeating, is a depressing one, because I don't know that even the sort of most paid up member of the Benjamin Netanyahu fan club will probably struggle to say, because I think for a while you might have been able to cling to the idea he's going to eradicate Hamas and free all the hostages. You've got the father of a hostage being pelted with eggs by Netanyahu's supporters, so I'm afraid that ship has sailed. The idea that Israel does its best to minimise civilian casualties, that ship has sailed, unless you really are fibbing to yourself. The idea that the ideology that lies behind Hamas and Hezbollah are two different ideologies, but they have common ground when it comes to the future of Israel, can somehow be removed. You can persuade children to abandon a cause by killing their parents. Seems to me to be ridiculous. And people in Israel, I think, probably, somewhat oddly, the longer it goes on, the more the siege mentality takes place, and therefore the more support for what Netanyahu is doing might grow, which seems contradictory from the outside. But if you were inside and feeling beset from all borders, I think it might begin to make more sense. And if he's banking on anything, if he's thinking beyond tea time tomorrow at any point, Benjamin Netanyahu might well be banking on that. It's 10:30. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Jenny Barsby has your headlines. 10:33 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where the question of how will it end and what has changed as a consequence of A, the October the 7th terror attack on Israel, and B, the response by Israel in both Gaza and latterly Lebanon. I mean, if you're in Israel, do you feel safer now than you did 366 days ago? Does it feel like Israel has become a more secure place as a consequence of Netanyahu's actions? It's possible. I'd need you to tell me. Of course, if the answer is no, then what has been achieved? What is the continuing point? Except that, and sometimes I don't. I'm allergic to the idea that complicated questions have simple answers. But sometimes Occam's razor kicks in, doesn't it? And the idea that almost all of this can be explained beyond that point at which most of us felt Israel would reach. The point of retaliation, stroke revenge, stroke response, whatever word you prefer, is needed. Hamas cannot be allowed to walk away from the events of a year ago unpunished. And the punishment would almost certainly have to involve the killing of civilians. And all of the disingenuous claims that they will be trying very, very hard not to kill civilians are designed solely as a sop to people who would support Benjamin Netanyahu, whatever he decided to do next. And they need sops. People need to be given fig leaves to hide their own truth. But that once that point was disappearing far into the rearview mirror, and the response had dwarfed the original offence, and then, of course, moved on to a territory that had absolutely nothing to do with the original offence in the case of Lebanon and Hezbollah, then the notion that it's all about self-preservation for Benjamin Netanyahu comes perilously close to being the only answer that fits all the facts. Because you can't see how it ends. You can't realistically argue that there has been, quotes, achievements, end quotes. The death is unthinkable, absolutely unthinkable. The scale of destruction and death still growing as we speak is, I'm beyond comprehension. Simple comparisons with what's happened in Ukraine give you an idea of how anomalous this is on the world stage in many ways. And the inability to posit improved security, greater safety, the gains, the benefits, I can't identify any of them. And therefore, the only answer to all of these questions that fits all of the facts at the moment is that it is all being done because of the personal ambition and self-preservation of Benjamin Netanyahu. 0345 60973 is the number that you need. I'll read this. I'll read a few of these today. Oh God, listened to you for 2 minutes and it is already 2 minutes too long. How dare you, writes Jessica. Nothing has dwarfed the original offence. Might I remind you our hostages are still sat rotting in the tunnels under Gaza? Well, I hope you listen for another 2 minutes because the father of one of those hostages was pelted with eggs last night by Benjamin Netanyahu supporters, and the word dwarfed is used to describe the death toll. If you're uncomfortable with that word, then I'm afraid it's counting that you've got a problem with, not an opinion. In fact, the death toll in Lebanon is heading north as we speak. So you're going to end up with more dead people in Lebanon, which had nothing to do with the October the 7th terror attack, than we had on that dreadful day 1 year ago. So if I were you, I'd turn your radio off again because it's the truth you can't handle, Jessica. Dove is in Temple Fortune. Dove, what would you like to say?
Yeah, hi, good morning, James.
Hello,
I've been listening on and off to LBC for the past year, since October 7th. I've heard you a couple of times as well.
And before that, I hope.
I'm an old-time listener. But I thought today, October 7th, I wanted to call and speak to you.
Yes.
I wanted just to remind you, and I guess all the listeners, just how dangerous words can be. And when people, make statements like the one you just said just now, that the Lebanon situation had nothing to do with the original movements of October 7th. I mean, that's just a dangerous statement to make on air, which is absolutely false.
To be fair, you'd already rung in before I'd made it, so let's focus on why you rang in, and then we can move on
if we can come back to that,
to the next point.
I will come back. I'll come back. I'll come back to the fact that words are dangerous, and you asked about how will it end. Obviously, I'm not a prophet. None of us are. There are three ways, really, isn't it? The first one is that Hamas, and win this, and with Iran, we're talking about Israel as a very powerful country. We know, backed by Iran, Hamas could win this, and there'll be no more Israel. There'll be no more Jews in Israel. So that's one option. That'll be gone completely. I don't think that would cause any more peace in the Middle East. I think if we look around the world, in the Middle East especially, Sunni Shiite fighting, I don't think that would see an end.
I wonder whether everybody listening realises that Hamas and Hezbollah are on different sides of that ancient 100%. Sectarian battle. I guess they hate each other, but they hate Israel more.
The problem we have is when we try with our Western eyes, with our Western understanding of philosophies, to understand the Middle East, it's two worlds. It's two worlds. And I don't mean that what's better and what's worse. I'm not coming from a place of better, worse, but we are trying. We're sitting here in London pontificating about a situation, and it's a different world. It's not the same.
Hey, you don't. Ringing in is voluntary, Dov. You're more than welcome not to pontificate on it. But the rest of us, will carry on trying to unravel some of this stuff and probably reject the notion of a sort of hierarchy of humanity that makes the actions of people in the Middle East impenetrable. So let's look at the question of what do you think has changed?
That was A. Then B is that that there is, and Israel would completely control. There'd be no more Palestinians left. But I think we've seen, that's not the Israeli people as a whole desire in any way, shape, or form.
Let me pause you there, because you've posited the destruction of Israel without any comment upon what ordinary Palestinian people or what ordinary people in the Middle East might want. But as soon as you posit the destruction of the Palestinian people, you're absolutely adamant that the Israeli population, literally 30 seconds after telling us that we shouldn't be pontificating on the motivation and the thoughts of anybody in the Middle East, you're drawing a huge distinction between how comfortable Israelis would be with the destruction of the Palestinian people versus absolute silence on how comfortable Palestinian people would be with the destruction of Israel. And you didn't even notice you were doing it, did you?
No, because I'm not pontificating. I'm just, you asked, your question was, what can happen? I'm just saying three scenarios. I'm not actually.
But the first scenario was offered up without any mention of how ordinary people in Lebanon or Gaza or anywhere else in the Middle East would feel about the destruction of Israel. Whereas then your comment about the destruction of all the Palestinian people, you had to qualify it by saying, "Oh, but the Israeli people would never put up with that, or the Israeli people would never want that." So you're already, without realizing it, introducing a form of moral hierarchy.
I totally disagree with you, but let me get to the main thing I wanted to say to you, James.
If you would.
The saddest thing for me today, and it's a very sad day, and I know you're going at me, and I don't mind, I get it. You can go if you want, but the saddest thing, and it's a really sad day. I'm a rabbi here in London, and the sadness is beyond the death, the destruction on both sides. I remember coming home from school in 1993, September 1993. I came home from school. My mum said, "Put the telly on right now." The White House lawn, where Yitzhak Rabin shook hands with Yasser Arafat, and we all celebrated the idea that there can be hope, there can be a peaceful situation, there can be a peaceful solution. We all celebrated that. We all hoped that Oslo would work. We all wanted that. If you would have gone to Israel at the time, the rallies, yes, of course, there's always people that will reject that on both sides. We know that. But I want peace. We all wanted peace. We all want to see the Palestinians suffering, the children. They shouldn't have to suffer. I feel so sorry for the regular Palestinian people who just want to live their lives. And unfortunately, we have completely misunderstood that there's something called Hamas. And Hamas are a religious extremist organization that are not interested.
And indeed, of course, the person that killed Yitzhak Rabin was member of an extremist religious organization as well.
Of course, as I said to you, I just said as extremists. I said there are extremists. I did say
you went effortlessly from the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin to describing Hamas. We should probably say a word about Yigal Amir and people in the Israeli cabinet, that were his allies.
I'm not trying to be belligerent with anyone. I'm just saying the point.
No, I'm just providing people with the context they need to understand your point. Yitzhak Rabin was murdered by an Israeli Jew, an extremist, a religious extremist whose grouping is represented now in Benjamin Netanyahu's cabinet. Something that must bring both of us great pain.
No, it doesn't give me great joy at all.
I said pain.
No way at all. A pain, 100%.
Yeah.
Definitely. Again, I want to see a peaceful solution, and you would ask all my friends, congregants throughout. This is the most painful.
You're never going to get it, are you? While Hamas remains in power in Gaza, and allies of Yigal Amir remain in power in Israel.
Right. Listen,
I'm sure listening.
You've heard this statement before, right? I think it was Golda Meir that said it, right? If Israel put down its weapons tomorrow, right, there would, if the Hamas put down their weapons tomorrow, Israel would be able to make a peaceful situation, which we saw in 1993. They were willing to go and do it.
But Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by an Israeli Jew. You can't keep going back to this point as proof of some sort of golden age.
And they shake hands in the White House or not? Did they try to make a peaceful solution?
And who killed Yitzhak Rabin?
That's an irrelevant point.
How can it be irrelevant, Dov?
Because you're
trying to do, and I understand why, and I understand also that you can't see that you're doing it. You're trying to put all of the responsibility on one side of a conflict, all of it. And yet, in order to do that, you have to completely ignore the fact that Yitzhak Rabin, whose example is something I wish everybody in power at the moment could follow, was assassinated by a religious extremist, an Israeli Jew, and that his worldview is now represented in Benjamin Netanyahu's cabinet. So you can't, it's extraordinary that you don't realize what you're doing, but to try to portray this as an intractable problem created by one side of a two-sided conflict is, and this perhaps is something that's changed over the course of the year, is that nobody would buy that anymore outside of a vanishingly small and shrinking community.
Okay, so listen, let's go on the other side.
You keep saying listen.
Why are you not at any point in time? I know I did listen to you. I get it. I just don't think it's a relevant point. I think it's
you don't think the fact that Yitzhak Rabin, who you phoned into sight, was assassinated by an Israeli Jew, is relevant to your portrayal of the problem as being insoluble because of Hamas, and the fact that you can't.
James,
you're not listening.
No, you're not listening. Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, of course you can.
Did Israel pull out of Gaza and the West Bank after the Oslo Accords?
But were the people living there free?
Can I ask a question? Did they pull out to try and make a peaceful situation?
What do you mean by pull out? Do you mean did they have troops on both sides of the border or just on one side?
Well, again, there were obviously...
These are just words that you don't like. So you tell me, were the people living on the other side of the border as free to go about their business as the people on the Israeli side? Could they fly to London and back whenever they wanted?
Let me ask you.
You need to answer these questions, Dov.
Okay, after 6-Day War...
Answer the question.
In 1967...
Answer the question, Dov. I've answered your question. Answer mine.
Yeah.
Were the people in Gaza as free to go about their business as the people in Israel were?
Well,
yes or no? Come on.
Of course, there was a process.
Yes or no?
There was a process.
Yes or no?
Not immediately, no.
Well, now, today?
That's a whole different story.
Ever?
Hamas took
when?
over.
When was the last time the people in Gaza were as free to go about their business as the people in Israel were?
That's the saddest thing. I wish they were.
Could you just answer the question? When was it?
It's irrelevant when it was.
Well, everything that you don't like is irrelevant. And everything that you do like is wrong. Up to and including the fact that you cite Yitzhak Rabin as a model that we all follow and think it's irrelevant that he was assassinated by somebody whose comrades in arms now sit in the Israeli cabinet alongside Benjamin Netanyahu. I'll give you one more chance. Just answer the question. When was the last time people in Gaza were as free as people in Israel?
The last time people in Gaza was probably 1948, probably, before the Egyptians took it.
Just after they were removed from Israel?
Well, no, that's not true. 1948.
Okay, well, so we've gone from it's irrelevant to it's not true now. Thankfully, there are history books. 10:50 is the time. I wonder, really, whether historians of the future will boil everything down to the illegally occupied territories, because you can talk until you're blue in the face, whether you are pontificating on the radio or whether you are actively involved in negotiations, whether publicly or privately, and that it seems extraordinary that it isn't the front and centre element of every conversation that any of us ever have. If Israel were to withdraw from the illegally occupied territories and the settlements were to be abandoned, then the conversation changes forever. And indeed, international sympathy or your sympathy or whatever you want to call it would have to shift as a starting point for negotiation. I don't know. Maybe that is me being a little bit naive or simplistic. 10:51 is the time. And of course, those of us who refuse to feel more sadness or more sorrow or more horror at the death of a Palestinian than we do at the death of an Israeli or than we do at the death of an Israeli compared to the death of a Palestinian, I appreciate some people find it hard to get their head around that, but you commemorate the atrocity of October the 7th a year ago today. The idea that you do that while ignoring the fact that people are still being killed in both Gaza and now Lebanon is, I'm afraid, to my mind, utterly horrific, because it's human death that we are commemorating and seeking to stop. Which brings us to the next question. How does this end? How does it stop? It's possibly a little bit too depressing to focus upon the question of what's changed, because, well, I dread to think, frankly. Arlam is in Kensington. Arlam, what would you like to say?
Well, thank you so much for taking my call. Look, I am a British or Palestinian origin, and I was in the West Bank just last September visiting my family, whatever it is, and I left just exactly 1 week before the 7th of October. What I would like to say that I walked in Jerusalem. I walked in Nablus, where I come from. I've seen the poverty. I've seen the terrifying eyes. I've seen the young soldiers' provocation. And what was worse is the young settlers. Young settlers are to the teeth and standing there basically to provoke everybody. I had to stay one night in Tel Aviv, and I managed to go just going around, and I could see the difference between it. You cannot believe it. You cannot believe it. Yes, it is heartbreaking what happened on the 7th October, because I don't want any child, whoever it is, to be killed and losing his life. I don't want any mother to suffer like what all our women suffers loss of a child. But I need to look forward. Number one, Israel at the moment is going with extremist far-right government, and that is blinded only to protect himself. He is not bothered about Jewish or Jews or Israelis or anything. This is where international community should intervene. We have given them impunity for the past 75 years. 75 years, a child across the border, seeing how they living, taking the water from his mouth, to drink, and they are having swimming pools. Enough is enough. And look, I know so many decent Jewish people. I know of how Daniel Levy, who was one of the advisors in negotiations here and there, saying it publicly that Israel have not followed any international law or anything. But again, they are not changing. They are not changing because they got used to impunity. And it's not healthy for their society either, what's happening, what we are watching on the news or in
because people are programmed to, understandably, to defend. And then when the regime moves into the realms of the indefensible, defend it. Well, I think the last caller showed us possibly what that sounds like. Yeah. But how do you see it ending? And I don't mean in your dreams. I mean in reality.
No. In reality, there are now some Israelis and Jewish people waking up. Enough is enough. It's a two states for two people, and there is a new initiative which I've been invited to help, called One Land for All, where you create two sovereign states without borders for preparation of confederation.
But surely the events of the last year have seen us move further away from that than ever before.
I know.
I need to push you then on the question of how you think the current round of conflict will end, or at least pause semi-permanently.
It has to end. We cannot pause it because it will be temporary until it erupts again. We need international community to recognize.
But when does so? Absent Benjamin Netanyahu leaving power, when does he call off the troops?
Well, we need to start with a cease. We need to start not sending any more arms to Israel. That's number one.
But again, you're telling me what you want to happen, not what you think will happen, I think.
No,
Because I mean, it may be that the answer is none of us know, but in terms of, because America's not going to abandon Israel. I mean,
don't want anybody to abandon Israel, but we want Israel to abide by international law like any other country, like any other state in the world.
But again, you're telling me what you want to happen, not what might or could happen. I think perhaps I'm mishearing you, but it is
happen. Look, Netanyahu is dragging the whole area for a regional war and dragging the U.S. to face.
Well, there you go. So that's an answer. So that's an answer. You mean a regional war is how the current round ends, but that's not how the conflict ends.
It will not end because even if he wants to drag a regional war, the other countries in the area, in the region, are not willing for war. They don't want. I don't want war. Nobody wants war. He is the only one who is dragging Israel and dragging the international world, including America, to an unjustified war. They're unjustified. You know why? Because the roots of this war has not been addressed long time ago, 75 years when Israel was created. Nobody bothered about next door living a young boy, refugee, deprived from life and education and everything. And now the situation is worse. And this is what I would love leaders in this world to get to know. I would love Stammer and his wife in particular, who got children, to realize that this is an endless war if we do not handle it with firmness to Netanyahu in particular. I don't wish any harm for any Jewish person, whether here or there. But at the same time, you cannot ever guarantee somebody who has been.
I'm not. I mean, the prospect of a war in the region seems to be growing rather than diminishing. The idea that nobody really wants that except Netanyahu is certainly an intellectually defensible position. I don't know that Iran would want it, but there comes a point at which they, as you suggest, would get dragged into it. But I don't know. I mean, I don't know what Keir Starmer can do about it. I mean, I'd like to see him doing more. I mean, this ludicrous idea that you keep calling for a ceasefire while doing precious little to bring one about, albeit the suspension of arms licenses sees this government go further than previous ones. I think all roads lead to the White House under what you're describing. But again, I could be wrong. And that question of self-preservation. And personal ambition for Benjamin Netanyahu. I like Occam's razor. I don't like simple answers to complicated questions, but Occam's razor posits the idea that the first and easiest answer to a question is probably the correct one. So why does this continue? Nicola says, stop firing rockets, stop threatening the Jewish people, and there'll be peace. Well, let's imagine that were true. Then the people in Gaza remain effectively incarcerated in a tiny corner of land, and the rockets stop, their situation doesn't improve at all. But again, I think when I have to explain things that to people, I think I must have misunderstood their text. 3 minutes after 11 is the time. Let me just give you a few texts to illustrate why I find these conversations both necessary and often close to unbearable. Here's Chris. You are full of it, O'Brien. Would those resistance groups exist if Israel wasn't corrupt? Joel writes, absolutely mental, James. How can you possibly say Iran don't want war when they have not only fired hundreds of missiles at Israel directly, they are also waging war via their proxies in Hamas, Hezbollah and the Houthis? I'll address that one. I can't really address the first one, except to say that resistance groups is not the legally recognised term to describe terrorists, Chris. But, Joel, it's the fact that Iran is conducting conflict using proxies that proves that they don't want all-out war at this point. If they wanted all-out war at this point, there's nothing to stop them from having it. But using proxies is historically what you do if you're trying to avoid all-out war. But, hey, you carry on calling me mental. Well, I could go on, but I want to do something rather more important, and that is to introduce you to Maoz Inon, who is an Israeli entrepreneur. Spoke to me late last week from Israel about the fact, among many other things, and I want you to really stop whatever you're doing and listen to this conversation, that his parents, Bilha and Yacovi, were killed on October the 7th, a year ago today, when their house The family home was hit by a close-range missile in that Hamas attack on Israel. Miles is now a peace activist. His parents always were. They were kibbutzers who lived in the hope of harmony and the hope of peace with their near neighbours. And, well, you can listen to this. And I begin, as you will hear, by very reluctantly taking him back to the events of a year ago today. We must begin, with your permission, by going back to the morning of October the 7th and I mean, how you and your siblings realised that something was, well, that your parents were in peril.
Yeah, it started with receiving a WhatsApp message from my father. He sent it at 6:35 a.m. And I woke up a few minutes after and read it. And he described there that they are shooting and alerts and sirens and noise of war. It sounds crazy, I know, but it's normal. It happens every few months, once a year. So I didn't thought anything special about it, just that it's another day of those days. As I was making coffee and watching the news, I started seeing that the wall was fallen in some places, and the Hamas trucks in the communities where I was born, and my parents live only 200 meters from the border. The wall was shadowing their house, literally. So that's when I called Dad at 7:30, and I could hear my mom in the background, and he's saying that they are in the safe room. They lock the house, and again, that there is so much noise of war. So I just asked him to send my love to Mom and for himself, of course, and that I'll call them soon. And then a few minutes after, I tried to call again, but this time there was no answer. So I called my sisters, my young brother was based in London, and we tried to reach them, their neighbors, and there was just literally no answer.
And that is when you begin to fear the worst.
Exactly. And that's where we decided to gather together at my sister's house. My brother got tickets to come back home.
Right.
And names start coming, names of victims of the Hamas attack, of our neighbors, of our childhood friends, and in 5:50 in the afternoon, this catastrophe basically reached us when we were able to reach one of their neighbors who told us that my parents' house is burned to ashes and that there are 2 bodies inside.
I'm so sorry for your loss. You honour their memory, and I wonder if you could tell us a little about them. They were, for example, dedicated to peace.
They were dedicated. They were dedicated parents, grandparents. They were among the pillars of their community. My father was an admirable farmer. For 60 years, he was sowing wheat in the fields of Israel. He was loved and praised by so many people. He was the chairman of their community, Netiva Asara, for 2 terms on a voluntary basis. They were both very fit and in the prime of their life. Even though my father was 78 and my mom 76, they were practicing yoga, Pilates, swimming, walking. They are very much involved in all their 11 grandchildren's life. My mother was a very talented artist. She had a studio who miraculously was saved completely.
Gosh.
She was painting mandalas. She was teaching adults, elderly, youth, children. And again, they're very loving and supporting mother and father, but parents and friends.
You wrote in April, Maus, that since the 7th of October, we as a family have learned some very important lessons. Could you tell me about some of those lessons, please?
Yes, it's the lessons of hope, the lesson of the future, and the lesson of forgiveness. We learned that hope is not something you can find or lose or someone else will give you. It's something that you create, you make. And one cannot make hope by himself. He must do it with others by envisioning a better future and acting to make it into reality. And basically, this is what me and my four siblings are doing. We're envisioning a better future for both Palestine and Israel.
And I think that some people will find it both surprising and inspiring that you all five decided almost immediately that you did not want revenge.
Yeah, you are right. What we realized is that we were prepared for October 7th. We were prepared to our parents' death, to know what to do, what to say, and how to act. And ironically and sad as it is, we were prepared by our parents. And only 3 days after losing them, my young brother Magen asked the family to send a universal message that we are seeking no revenge. That by revenging the death of my parents, we're not going to bring them back. We're just going to escalate the cycle of war, of bloodshed, of revenge that is going on for a century now between the river to the sea, and it's time to end this cycle. And this is our mission. Our mission is to break this cycle and to offer and walk an alternative path, the path of peace and reconciliation.
And you receive messages of solidarity for that message from, well, all corners, really, of the conflict.
All over, and many Palestinians. Many Palestinians we knew or we were friend and partner with in the last recent years, but many that we never met. And from all the Israelis MPs, including opposition and coalition, we have 120 MPs here in Israel. Only two that called us were Palestinians. Palestinians with Israeli citizenship that are acting as an active parliament members. They were the only one to reaching out to pay their condolences, their empathy, while no one from the government, the coalition, or the Jewish Israeli opposition bother to call us.
Why?
And I think they just don't care.
Right.
I think they just don't care.
I mean, this is quite the journey that you've been on, up to and including the TED talk that you gave with Aziz Abu Sara, which I mean that is a surprising partnership, isn't it? In many ways.
I think it's not surprising. I think this is the only the only future is by partnering.
Because he lost his brother and you lost your parents, so the loss is the uniting force.
Exactly. We both lost our loved one. We both are angry. We both are in pain, in suffering. But we don't compete to suffer more. We don't even try to blame anyone. We have just decided to partner, to work together, and create a better future for all of us living here between the river to the sea, Palestinian Israelis. And we are on the same side. It's not if you must divide us between sides, please divide us by those who believe in equality, in dignity, in reconciliation, in security and safety, and those who don't believe in it yet. But Palestinian Israelis, we are together. We formed a peace movement, a people peace movement that is shared by civil society organization, by individual, that being supported by the international community, and we together are taking the leadership, and that unfortunately our politicians are unable to do because
I love your use of the word "yet." There, that it is that hope that drives everything you do, I think. But I must take you back again 6 months when you wrote of the lack of leadership on both sides to get out of it, and also that the war must be stopped. A disaster of historic proportions is happening right now. I'm reluctant to remind you of the next line that you wrote because this is in April. We don't want to even imagine what will happen if this is allowed to go on for another 6 months. And here we are today, 6 months later.
So unfortunately, what we've been received from the world so far is thoughts, prayers, and President Biden even said he's crossing our fingers for us. And what we need is action. We need action, because if there will be no action, I'm afraid that, James, you will interview me again in 6 months, and the number of casualties will double, will triple, and it's not going to be a regional war. We might deteriorate to a global war, because the entire world is investing now in war, in bloodshed, in revenge, and we must stop it. We must stop it. And I'm speaking to so many people from all over the world. And what I have two things to say. First is that peace is possible. Peace is possible, and we are at the footsteps of precipice. It can be the precipice of global war, and it can be the precipice of global peace. And we need to decide which way we want to go. Unfortunately, the policies so far, we are being pushed into a global war, and we must stop it. Each one of us is accountable. We won't be able to blame afterwards the leaders or the politician or the extremists, because we'll pay with our life. So many are winning the debate now, but we are losing our life.
Pushed by whom, Miles? When you say pushed, who is doing the pushing?
I think it will start with the US.
Yes.
US that using Israel as a proxy. Iran is using Hezbollah and Hamas as a proxy. And it's a madhouse that no one is being the adult or acting as a mature to stop it. War will never bring security. Bombs will never bring quiet, and war will never bring defense. Only dialogue, only negotiation. And when Israel decided to choose this path in the past, we got a tremendous success. The only two borders of Israel that are now secure and safe is the Egyptian one and the Jordanian one. Again, two nations that we had several wars with. And Jordan is now also helping us stopping the missiles coming from Iran. So from an enemy, it became like a very strong partner. But our extremist government and the other extremist players in the Middle East are thriving on this bloodshed. Yes. This is how they stay in power, and no one stops them.
Away from the leadership, what is the biggest obstacle for your vision among ordinary people? I mean, whether they are Palestinians or Israelis, what is it that people that you can see that they can't see?
They cannot see that peace is possible.
Okay.
And in this also from the international community, because I'm grateful for you for not asking it, but many ask me like it's Americans or British or German or French journalists if peace is possible. And I always tell them, you are the answer. 80 years ago, there was a war waging in Europe, the Second World War, and tens of millions of people died. And it took you 6-7 years to understand, to the sixth founding nation of the EU, that in order to prevent the next war, you must make the enemy of the past into the partner of the future. This is your legacy. You're the proof that peace is possible. So why won't you send us tools of construction? Why don't you support the Palestinian and Israeli peace movement, like many of them already acknowledge and agree to do, including your current prime minister? When he was in the opposition, he said that he will support by funds the civil society in Israel and Palestine to achieve a conflict resolution and a lasting peace.
Yes.
So now we want to make sure, and I'm asking him, is it just a dead word? Was it a politician promise? Or is it your policy? So if it's your policy, please act now.
Yes, I will remind him of that if I talk to him anytime soon. I think you may have answered my final question, which is, how do you retain your hope?
For me, it's my father. It's for my parents. It's very easy answer. So my parents, it doesn't matter how devastating the year before was in the fields, if it's through drought or floods or insects, he will always say, next year I'm going to sow again because next year will be better. I have the agency to change the future, even though I cannot predict it. And my mom gave me and my siblings the power to dream and to dream big and to have the courage to, she raised us with the courage to chase our dream. And now we are all dreaming on one thing. We are dreaming of peace. And with our parents' legacy and with our partners, Palestinian, Israelis, and international, we're going to make it. We're going to make it because peace is possible. And we're going to prove again. And I think this is what humanity needs, to renew the vows of that were signed and achieved after the Second World War. Because if we won't renew it now, it can happen again, not just here between the river to the sea, but globally. So don't support us as poor Israelis and Palestinians. Support us for yourself, for your own interest. I think there is now a major alert for the national security in the UK because of the anniversary of October 7th. The extremism, the polarization, the rise of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism is impacting the global communities. So for your good, for your benefit, we must make peace now between the river to the sea.
Maoz Inon, thank you.
Thank you very much, James. And thank you for listening, and thank you for amplifying those voices. You cannot imagine how meaningful and important it is to us.
I'm not sure Maoz could imagine how meaningful and important that conversation would be to you. And I say that just by glancing at my inbox. Maoz Inon, and I'll spell that name for you properly in case you want to find out more about the work that he continues to do. It's Maoz, new word, I-N-O-N. And if you tuned in halfway through that, you should know that Maoz's parents, Bila and Yaakov, were killed on October the 7th when their house was hit by a close-range missile in the Hamas attack on Israel one year ago today. And he is now, as you heard, a tireless and almost unbelievably optimistic peace activist, an inspiration. I think it's an overused word, but he's certainly an inspiration to me. And rest assured, not only will we pass on some of your warm words, but we will also be keeping in touch with Maoz as well. I'll read this from Ray because I think it'll put a smile on everybody's face. James, when you said to stop whatever you were doing and listen to this, I thought you were chatting rubbish. Thank you to you and your guest. 24 minutes after 11. I mean, I don't know what you took away from that conversation with Maoz Inon, but there was certainly both a reflection of the conversation we were already having and perhaps a little indication of where it might go. I couldn't believe what I read, so I don't know what I'm going to say. How many times have I told you? I don't know what I'm going to say at 10 o'clock in the morning until the light comes on, but I conduct interviews like that as well. I like do a little bit of research, as much research as I can or as seems appropriate, but I never know what direction the conversation is going to go in because I don't know. If I was interviewing you, I don't know what your answer to my first question will be. So I ask you my first question, and the second question will almost certainly be informed by whatever you said in response to my first question. It's why on a completely different subject. It was why I was so confused last week when a BBC journalist said she had to call off her whole interview with Boris Johnson because she'd accidentally sent him her briefing notes. I couldn't quite work out what that even meant in the consequences. Surely Boris Johnson's not going to be taken by surprise by any well, anyway, who knows? But I didn't know where it would go, but I did know that there was one line in the article that Maoz Inon wrote last April that just broke me. I mean, the idea that if we do not stop this direction of traffic, he wrote, we don't want to even imagine what will happen if this is allowed to go on for another 6 months. And that was 6 months ago. Already more people dead in Lebanon than were murdered on October the 7th, just in the last month. We don't want to even imagine what will happen if this is allowed to go on for another 6 months. There has already been an unimaginable toll of casualties, and who can be better qualified to comment on that toll of casualties than someone who has buried their peace-loving parents? Kibbutzes. And while I was talking to him, I should tell you this, I didn't tell him actually, The photograph I had in front of me was the photograph that accompanied his article for The Independent last April. He wrote it with one of his siblings, Megan. But it showed his parents on... Oh, dear, that one's rather ambushed me. I wasn't expecting that. There is a picture of his dad, Yakovi, sort of mugging for the camera, pretending to eat some cherries that he'd just grown. And so I'm looking at that while he talks. When I said, "Where'd you get your hope from?" And he said, "I get my hope from my dad." And if his crops failed, he planted them again and waited for the next year. You know, Samuel Beckett had something to say about that, didn't he? Fail, fail again, fail better. And I'm looking at that picture of his dad joking around for the camera and his beautiful, warm-hearted mother looking straight down the lens of the camera. And he is talking to me about how he sustains hope that I found almost unbelievable by thinking about what his parents would do. And his parents, of course, were killed on that day. So I think we probably have to do what he told us not to do. And we have to imagine today what will happen if this is allowed to go on for another 6 months, which is a variation on the question that we started with at 10 o'clock today. That question being, how does it end? How does it even begin to... What's the beginning of the end? Never mind the end of the end. What is the beginning of the end? Given that I don't think anybody, and I think back to the calls that we took from people who were adamant that Israel had to do something, and I agreed in the first instance, and then when it began to feel as if they'd done far too much, people couldn't tell me how much was too much. I don't know if you remember. How much is too much? How many deaths is too many deaths? And that was the point when I got really, really, really scared. Because goodness knows, people ringing a radio station, a tin pot radio presenter in London who were refusing to contemplate the possibility of there being too much death as a response to the deaths of October the 7th. If that was present on my switchboard, God knows what was going on in the minds of people more outwardly and obviously supportive of Benjamin Netanyahu, up to and including the members of his cabinet with convictions for terror offences and all manner of horrific backstories. And that's when I stopped, or rather, almost when I stopped hoping, if you like, that there would be what Mao Zedong wants, that there would be a cessation of hostilities before 6 months had passed. Another 6 months in now, 12 months in, and we wonder what it's going to look like 6 months from now. Donald Trump might be back in the White House. God knows what that means for this benighted region. But that idea, I mean, his message is simple. The war must be stopped, the hostages and the prisoners released. And crucially, this war must be the last war. It seems to us, he wrote 6 months ago, that the world has learned nothing since the 7th of October. Absolutely nothing. It is clear that after 6 months of war, the security and safety of Israel is not getting better. In fact, it is only getting worse. Meanwhile, the lives of more and more innocent people in Gaza are sacrificed. And that is the point at which he speculated on what the world would look like 6 months hence, which is where we are now. It is now 6 months hence. We need to ask ourselves, what should we all be doing now so that we are not ashamed of ourselves in 20 years' time? And we'll start addressing some of those questions after the very latest news headlines with Jenny Barsby. 11:34 is the time. I always enjoy a little bit of friendly pedantry. This from Sam. James, not to be too picky, but people who live on a kibbutz are called kibbutzniks, or to be ultra correct, kibbutznikim. Just for your information. And Sam adding her voice to all the voices coming out to praise and indeed admire my last guest, Mao Zedong, who is on Twitter, actually. I've just retweeted from his account an article he's written for a UK newspaper, for The Guardian, about the journey that he has been on over the course of the last year, the year since his mother was murdered at her kibbutz. 11:34 is the time. So if we were to look forward 6 months, what might we realistically expect to see? What has changed? What has been achieved? I use that word very loosely. And what might the beginning of the end look like? Hafsa is in Dubai. Hafsa, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello.
Thank you for taking my call. Just to caveat what I want to say by saying I think that your interview and the powerful message is an example, not just to people, but practitioners and leaders and politicians, that civil society really should be at the, not just at the table, but leading the table for conflict resolution, because we could get a lot further if those voices had the weight that they should have, and all power to him and for his loss as well. But to sort of analytically look at this and not to sound callous, what Hamas decided, or with their terror attack on October 7th, was effectively to sacrifice what was left of the Palestinian cause on the ground in an attempt to break, possibly irreparably, Israeli deterrence. And what I mean by deterrence is not the Iron Dome and the various security arrangements, but the deterrence that the leadership and successive governments for decades have sold and had their citizens buy into, that occupation and this type of occupation is necessary for security and stability. And that has effectively been, in many ways, completely broken away.
Whoa, do you really think so?
I think in the sense
I'm pretty sure that an awful lot of Israelis, not just the ones that are full-throated in their support for everything that Netanyahu does, would probably look back over the last year and think that it makes a case for more security and more.
That's what I'm getting to. That's
right.
The sort of how does this evolve?
Okay.
In response, and my personal opinion is the wrong lessons have been learned across the board, but that aside, the Israeli the government and major parts of the security apparatus, the position now is that occupation has not worked. So the only answer is annexation.
Okay.
And Palestinians, therefore, either live under apartheid, leave forcibly displaced, or with the continued campaigns in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza, will die. And that expansion, and what we've seen with the expansionist agenda away and outside of the borders of the occupied territories, Lebanon, attacks in Syria, and now the activation of this so-called, axis of resistance, is both opportunity, which is that with the decapitation of the majority of Hamas political and security leadership, Hezbollah the same, is to effectively believe, and this is brought into by senior officials at the White House, that they can instigate regime change in Tehran. The baseline of that will remain annexation of the entirety of the occupied Palestinian territories, and that will become the ultimate goal for Israel and its own internal security.
Supported by America?
I would say across the board, at least in terms of senior leadership in the White House and the State Department, yes. That is, at least under this administration. Whether it changes under, we can't say a Donald Trump administration, so let's say a Harris administration.
Kamala Harris
depends on the members inside Biden's team that do or do not remain in their positions should she win. And I'm talking here about Brett McGurk and Amos Hochstein.
But would the White House or a Biden White House, if such a thing were to still exist, which of course it won't, whatever happens next month, but would America be complicit in what you're describing, or would they be taken advantage of?
I think it's a difficult question to answer in the absolute, because there is a sense that over the year that has changed. We have swung from a pendulum of trying to convince the Israelis versus people in the administration who want this and want all-out war with Iran. But what I'd just like to say is that ultimately the calculation for the U.S., because of a year of complete steadfastness against doing anything material,
meaningful,
to pull back Israel, has incredibly increased now. So to come and say to Israel now, or to try to, even if that was the intention.
So you mean a sort of double down theory, is that you can't do it now because you haven't done it for a year?
Well, the cost is so high now. The cost is so high because now we have legitimate attacks, and in the framing of that, legitimate strikes from proxies and from Iran directly. Iran works the war of attrition. It does the long game. It does not.
How are they legitimate? They're legitimate because their response is in kind.
I mean the framing of now saying the Americans can no longer back off the Israelis because the Israelis say, we must respond to attacks on our territory. For the Iranians, of course, they've played the long game for 30 plus years on the nuclear file, on the proxy file. They know that they are militarily significantly inferior to the US and Israel. So they don't want a war. They don't want an all-out war. Deterrence has been built through the Axis. Parts of that deterrence have been broken significantly. We wait to see if that's irreparable in terms of Nasrallah's death and others in the months or years to come. But it's only entrenched and hardened the views where there were gaps in either Israeli society or within the security apparatus. It is notable that actors like Gallant and Gantz wanted the war with Lebanon more than they wanted the war in Gaza.
Yes. And they seem to be in the box seat. But we've talked about possible regime change in Iran and possible regime change in America. What about possible regime change in Israel itself?
Well, that goes back, I think, to prior to October 7th, which was the judicial amendments that were made and various different changes that make it very difficult now. And even now, post the killing of Nasrallah, new additions into the coalition that Netanyahu leads, it makes it now very difficult, not just on a numbers game, but in any legal framing, to remove this government and change it. I would also argue that the framing that this is all on Netanyahu...
To be fair, it's a heck of a lot harder to remove the administration in Tehran than it is to remove the one in Israel.
Well, I'm not giving my personal opinion on whether this would be successful or not. I think it's folly to instigate any
But you think
kind
that's
of
the plan?
military pathway.
You think that's the direction of traffic and indeed the plan? So I mean, the one bit that a lot of it confuses me. All of it confuses me. But if the leaders of Hamas had known what was going to happen, do you think they would have pressed ahead a year ago today with their attack on Israel?
I don't study Hamas in very great detail. I would point people like Tarek Bakoni and other writers who write very extensively about the history of Hamas. But there is argument to say no, they wouldn't have.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, when you speak to people like Admiral Ami Ayalon, the former head of the Shin Bet, and others, they talk very much about how something like this was always going to happen because of the nature of occupation. So I can't answer that in the abstract. I don't think anybody can, apart from Yahya Sinwar himself.
Yes.
But arguably, whether ever it was expected or decided to achieve such a heinous result inside Israel proper is kind of moot, if you will, because we are now where we are.
Because you're right, but you know how my mind works. Sometimes I try to tie things up even months after the event. Hafsa, thank you. Crikey, not exactly what you'd call an upbeat analysis, and somewhat at odds with the hope of Mao's Inon, who we spoke to just after 11 o'clock this morning. And it is indeed his words that we're looking at. Imagine, he wrote in April, what things would look like in 6 months if this is allowed to go on. Well, now we know. And Bloomberg UK puts it quite neatly today when it talks about, if it wasn't clear on October the 7th last year that Hamas's savage attack on Israel would change the Middle East, it is now. Crises have multiplied across the region and become a focal point in the US elections. Joe Biden seemingly impotent to influence Israel's response, part of Hafsa's analysis there. Israel fighting on multiple fronts, not just in Gaza, where Hamas continues to mount attacks and hold hostages, despite perhaps half of its 35,000-odd fighters being killed. The Palestinian territory, meanwhile, is devastated. Benjamin Netanyahu has sent troops into Lebanon to take on Hezbollah in what he hopes will be a short incursion, or at least Israel hopes it will be a short incursion. They're regularly hitting militias in Syria that, like Hamas and Hezbollah, receive training and funding from Iran. In Yemen, the Houthis are causing havoc with their continuing attacks on Israeli and Western-linked ships in the Red Sea, and they're firing drones and missiles at Israel despite being almost 2,000 kilometres away. And then, as Hafsa reminds us, there's Iran, which followed up its first ever direct attack on Israel in April, just after Maus wrote his article, with a barrage of 200 ballistic missiles last week. That followed the assassination of Nasrallah, Hassan Nasrallah, the Hezbollah leader. And although the damage from those attacks was slight, Netanyahu has vowed to retaliate and is under pressure from those extremists in his far-right administration. They want him to do so aggressively. So Where things will be 6 months from now is almost anybody's guess. But Bloomberg goes on, diplomatically, Israel is increasingly isolated as anger about the deaths of tens of thousands of civilians in Gaza and Lebanon grows. A US-led deal to normalize ties with Saudi Arabia is now on ice. It was very close a year ago. And that is one element that we've perhaps glossed over, which is how what I'd loosely describe as the Arab world, or the non-extremist parts of the Arab world, which is the majority of it, were on side with Israel. You know, that normalization of relations with Saudi Arabia, the Abraham Accords, there were things moving in the right direction. I think that's gone. I think he's hemorrhaged that. Sacrificed it, if you like, upon the altar of self-preservation. I'm not sure. But I don't think that I don't think many people could dispute that. Certainly not the relationship with Saudi Arabia, for good or for ill. Saudi Arabia is a horrific regime. But if you were prioritizing Israel's security and safety above everything else, warm relations with Saudi Arabia was a win for Israel, a win that has been tossed out into the trash. The problem is, this article goes on, there is no end in sight. And Netanyahu has no plan for Gaza once the fighting is over, or for achieving peace with the Palestinians, which is, oddly enough, roughly where we've ended up after almost 2 hours of puzzling over it. It is 10 to 12. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. In the next hour, it's a tough one, this. There's few things that well, it's probably a bit of an exaggeration, but I was going to say there's few things I hate more than when the older generation attack young people. But that's what we're going to do in the next hour. I'm old and I'm going to attack young. I'm joking. Well, kind of. Increasingly, I find myself returning to this territory. We circle this territory so much. But there is an article today, and I know I'm not going to tell you what paper it's in because you won't forgive me, that is apparently by a boss and directed at so-called Generation Z or Generation Z. And it describes how the attitudes of that sort of youngest cohort in the workforce are almost unbelievably at odds with what certainly people my age, and I think right down to millennials, would consider to be acceptable. And I've had it again. I've had a couple more stories that highlight how hard it is for employers to find people. What's the age range we're talking about? But under 25, give or take, is it? We're going to do another phone-in on whether I'm turning into Victor Meldrew or whether young people really are measurably different from how they were. Can I say it out loud? In our day. In my day. Did we invent a phrase? Did we call it in my dayism or something like that? In my dayism? Didn't catch on quite as much as footballification, did it? But before all of that, we return to the vexed and incredibly difficult territory of the situation in the Middle East. And of course, as that article I just referenced from Bloomberg UK reminds us, the situation has spread far beyond the locus of that attack on October the 7th or even the initial response into Gaza. I mean, how many people, if they were just tuning in now for the first time, would believe that the initial response into the Gaza Strip was supposed to be confined to one part of it? And I think that was possibly one of the first moments at which we should have paid more attention, or at which governments like Keir Starmer's or at the time Rishi Sunak should have paid more attention, when they told people in Gaza to move and then bombed where they used to live and then told them to move again and bombed where they'd moved to. That was perhaps the point at which we should have began to suspect that 12 months later we'd find ourselves where we are today. But where do you think we might be in 6 months? I don't know. Anthony's in Bromley. Anthony, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Thanks for taking my call. I think the last two callers that you put on obviously kind of shifted my mind a little bit on this, because it's not a simple quandary, is it? No. But there are some words that come to my mind, right? It's humanity. In terms of when I hear you talking about the dilemma, I hear lots of kind of points of humanity being brought to the table. Lots of people being killed, the pain that's being suffered. And the funny thing about those things is they kind of cloud the real issue underneath what's going on. And underneath those points as well, you've got a war of culture, you've got mindset, you've got politics, which is all causing a kind of, a haze in terms of what we're trying to kind of get to in terms of answering that question. From my perspective, as someone who feels, an immediate kind of affinity with suppressed. When it first happened, I was a little bit confused in the sense that, of course, this was going to happen because these guys are being, kind of confined to this little landmass. They're being, held in this, as we've heard people mention it being a open air prison. That was going to happen, but it doesn't mean. And also the response from Israel. Well, let's face it, they are a traumatized people. When this happens to them, they are going to react because they feel like they're being, negatively, impacted, well, to a high degree than just negatively impacted. So from my perspective, I see it as people who just want a desire for safety and to live out their life knowing that bombs aren't going to be thrown at them and they're going to live at peace. So from an Israeli perspective, I can see them being supported to go all the way. And that means that if they get support from, America to come in and help dispose of, the kind of leadership in Iran, that's what they want to do. Fair enough. I can understand them wanting to push for that. The rest of the world, us looking at that, see that in horror, but I can't see a way of...
No, I mean, the problem with it is it posits the achievability of peace through violence as opposed through peace through negotiation or peace through agreement. It's peace through oppression. And I don't know. I mean, it doesn't mean it's impossible. I think it's implausible, but it becomes inevitable, or at least pursuing it becomes inevitable when there's intractability on both sides. So that's why that's why talking to Maus was so uplifting, albeit that it's hard to share his levels of optimism, especially having buried his own buried his own parents. The idea that if I were Israeli and I were traumatized by the past and I was historically literate, some people draw distinctions between Israeli Jews who have a history in Europe and Israeli Jews who don't, but I find that a bit too complicated to fully understand. I would think that my safety hinges upon battering every potential threat into complete submission. I think that's what you're saying.
No, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And the evidence of recent past, if we think about the last 20-odd years or 30-odd years or whatever, in terms of the way that the West has reacted to traumatizing situations, we've battered everyone else right into submission.
No, we've tried to, but look how that's worked out.
Well, yeah.
I mean, that's the real lesson, isn't it? And then the real lesson is, okay, so what's the plan for when this round is finished? What happens to the people in Gaza, for example, that are still alive? What's Netanyahu's plan for them?
Yeah. I mean,
because if there isn't one, then this ain't going to be a full stop. It's going to be a comma.
Well, I think it's generational because once you've started to crush those individuals, the problem is that those are kids that remember what happened to their parents, yes. Right? So even if you get peace for 10 years or whatever, then what happens when they grow up? There's going to be enmity there. So I think it is a problem, but I think fundamentally, that Israeli mindset of we are traumatized every single day. We're under siege.
What everything we do is justified by our search for and our need for and our richly deserved quest for peace, and that underpins it. If I've taken anything from the last year, it's the realization of how easily Netanyahu can exploit that feeling to do things that become unconscionable. But if you can persuade yourself, or if you have been persuaded that they are being done in pursuit of what you describe, that haven, that notion of safety and security, then you can end up justifying almost anything. It's why some of the calls on this program have been so hard in the last year, because it's my job, I lead people to the point where they realize that they are actually prepared to justify anything, even though when they rang in they didn't think that they were. But that's when the international community has to step up, isn't it? That's the point that Maus made and that many others have made. That's the point where the outside world has to remind everybody involved in this conflict of the lessons of, for example, the Second World War or of the Irish peace process.
Well, but I think it depends what the mindset is. Because remember, we talked about humanity. Yeah. If we come off of that for 1 second and you think about culture and you think about mindset, well, you have to admit that there is a kind of cultural war against Islam that's going on, whether we like it or not. It's manifesting here in the UK, it manifests in the US. We can feel it. So
and you can't separate the two. So Saeed Owasi was in the studio on Friday talking about elements of what you describe and the impossibility of separating the two. And I don't think in the long term it serves those of us who absolutely recognise Israel, the modern state of Israel, and desperate for it to survive in its current form, albeit with slightly modified borders, I don't think that their interests are served by the conflation of support for Israel with the Islamophobia that's sweeping the much of the Western world. I certainly don't think that anybody who wants peace has their interests served by, for example, Suella Braverman describing people seeking a ceasefire as hate marchers. And that is precisely what Anthony is referring to. So maybe another conversation needs to be had, not about what is going to what things are going to look like in the Middle East 6 months from now, but what things are happening here as a consequence of what's happening there, the changes that it's making to life on these islands or life in this part of the world. Starmer has a big problem here with electoral support, but his majority is big enough to weather it for now. Harris's electoral prospects could be affected by Biden's policies in the Middle East. We'll have to wait and see. And Donald Trump, of course, you can guarantee only one thing about Donald Trump, that any bad situation he inherits will become immeasurably worse. Complete change of gear in the next hour, and maybe even some smiles. It is 3 minutes after 12, and it is a mark of perhaps how fraught the territory that we are about to explore together is, that I am drawing upon an anonymous article published by the Daily Mail today. There are elements of it that I find relatively ridiculous, and of course the question of why you wouldn't put your name to it if you stand by it remains. But I recognise some elements of what is being complained about here, and I don't think it's just because I am increasingly in danger of becoming a miserable old git. Is that an acceptable turn of phrase these days? That's a deliberate question, because if anybody takes offence at anything I say in a normal conversation, then it is likely to be someone younger than me. So if, for example, you are of the view that I am the leader of the woke rebellion in this, or one of the leaders of the woke rebellion, we don't have leaders in the woke rebellion because we think we're all equal. But some of us are obviously more equal than others. So if you think I am one of the leaders of the woke resistance, then you should know that my own children frequently find fault with the way in which I express myself, or point out that something I have said is a little bit ripe or a little bit robust for modern discourse. Not very often. I'm not exactly Bernard Manning, am I? Even off air. But the idea that there is that there is never tension between the younger generation and the older generation, even as members of the older generation, as being portrayed as being, we used to call it right on, didn't we? Hey, there it is. That's all that woke means, isn't it? It means right on in the 1980s. I don't know if you remember John Thompson's character. Was he called Bernard Right On? Do you remember that? So John Thompson used to come on to the... what did I see John Thompson in the other day? Oh, I'm watching that Martin Freeman drama, A Conversation, which has dropped on Netflix. God, it's good. I love John Thompson. So he I'm sure it was him, didn't it? Wasn't it him that had a character called Bernard Right On? So he'd come onto stage looking like a really old-fashioned club comic. It's like smoking a fag and drinking a pint. And you'd be thinking, oh, here we go. This is going to be a bit close to the bone. And he'd lean into the microphone and he'd go, an Englishman, an Irishman and a Pakistani walked into a pub. And you're going, oh, my God, where's he going with this? And he'd just go, what a fine example of cultural integration. And that was the joke. The joke was modernity. Still funny now, actually. So I mention that because I am conscious of being both woke and aging. So this is an article by a 48-year-old man who describes himself as a boss and writes about being frightened of his own team at work. Perhaps it was the moment I overheard my personal assistant refer to me as a stupid old boomer to someone on the other end of her mobile phone. Or was it the day when one of them went running to HR with mental health issues after I commented that their work wasn't up to the usual standard? Now, listen, if you write an article for the Daily Mail like this, what you submit and what actually appears in the paper can be quite different. I know, because in a previous life I wrote a couple of articles myself, never anonymously, I should stress. But they print what they want to print. They don't print what you wanted to write necessarily. So it may well be that some of the points here have been slightly exaggerated to drive home the idea that so-called Generation Z or Generation Z are driving a whole generation of bosses to give up their own jobs and to abandon their own business. But I have now spoken to, in my personal life, I have now spoken to four people of roughly my own age who run their own businesses. And they all have stories, and they all occasionally tune into the show, which is why they've raised the subject with me when I've seen them. Two people that I have been socialising with, and two people whose businesses I have... Is patronised the right word to use in that context? Whose businesses I have patronised in the last fortnight, and who took the opportunity of me visiting their business premises to comment upon a previous phone-in that they'd heard about people aged probably under 30 or under 20. Can we just take a view on this? Is it under 30 or under 25? It's under 25, isn't it? Do you see yourself as different from them? Yeah, millennial. Are you a millennial? Okay, so it's Generation Z, which is going to be roughly under 25, is it? Or thereabouts? 26 and under. Having an attitude to the workplace that the rest of us struggle to process or accept. There are two ways into this. I think it's true. I don't think this is a phone-in about whether it's true or not. I don't think it's helpful for me to sit here and share old war stories about what Fleet Street was like when I first started getting shifts there in the early to mid 1990s. It was a metaphorical war zone. The sexism, I didn't come across much racism actually, but the sexism, the casual homophobia, and the brutalization of junior members of staff. I would probably call it bullying now. At the time, I got a horrible feeling I would have called it banter. I've spoken to you about that before. And it is true. Some of the things that I put up with in my 20s would be absolutely unthinkable today, to the point where when I tell younger colleagues some of the stories about what was considered relatively normal back then, I can tell that they don't quite believe me. They think that I'm either exaggerating or making the whole thing up. And your response to what I'm saying now will depend upon your generation and your age. But and it was worse before me. The generation before me, particularly the sexism, was much worse before me. So someone 10 years older than me who came up through Fleet Street, who came up through journalism, is either going to still think that completely antediluvian and primitive attitudes are acceptable, and it's just the fault of the woke mob and the political correctness gone mad that you're not allowed to do and say these things anymore, even though you still privately think them. Or, thankfully, they're going to have realised that the world turns and that what they thought was normal was actually not normal. It was a consequence of gaslighting and grooming and social conditioning and all the rest of it. And what we thought was banter was bullying. Don't stop texting me about what the cut-off point is. I'm talking about people under 26. I've chosen a number, all right? And that's the one I'm going with. And, well, I'll give you some examples of the stories that I've heard, all right? You hire someone new. They come in, they beg for a job. They bring their CV with them. So this isn't someone lazy staying at home doing nothing. They come into your premises, retail premises, begging for a job, give you a CV, tell you they've always wanted to work in this field. So you give them a break. First day in the job, they go for their lunch at 1 o'clock and they don't come back. You ring them up and they don't answer their phone. They've just had enough. Their first taste of the workplace was, for now at least, their last. And then you've got the thing that is arguably more interesting, which is the idea that you see the job as something that suits your purposes. So you come in, you do a couple of days, and then you ring up the morning of day 3 and say, oh, I'm really sorry, I can't come in today. I've got some personal issues. And you say, well, what personal? I don't really want to talk about it, but hopefully I'll be in tomorrow. And you're there as a boss. You should see my mate's face when he tells me this story, because he's miming using the phone and everything. And he's quite an expressive character. And he's going, what am I to do? I have a business to run. I have people. I've got customers. My customers aren't taking a day off for personal reasons. And he says, look, if you tell me what the personal reasons are, and I sympathise, I mean, it's only your 3rd day, but still, I don't want to be the kind of guy that makes you come to work if you buried your dog this morning. Another one, I kid you not, all right? Someone comes in for a job interview. It's all going quite well. I've got two more. I've got stories coming out my ears on this. That shows you what an issue it is. So, remind me, say to me after, yes, someone is in the middle of a job interview and they say, oh, and by the way, there'll be some days when I won't be able to come in at quite short notice. So my mate goes, okay, why might that be? I said, well, my neighbours have just got a cat. My neighbours have just got a kitten. And sometimes I have to look after it. And my mate's going, I mean, even if it was your own kitten, this wouldn't be grounds for an unscheduled day off to give the boss a ring at 7 o'clock. I won't be able to come in today. I've got to look after my kitten. Even that would be unacceptable, right? But I can't come to work today. I've got to look after my neighbour's kitten. I thought it was a figure of speech. I thought it was like the way that all the drugs have new names now, and I just haven't kept up to date with from when I was a student. I said, my neighbours have got a kitten. What does that mean? What does that actually mean? And it turns out it means that their neighbours have got a kitten. It literally means that they have got a baby cat next door. Another one, same bloke actually, same boss, same scenario, doing an interview. Potential employee says, what's your penalty policy? This is at the job interview. What's your penalty policy for lateness? So he says, well, I'm pretty understanding. If obviously it's London, the transport it's better than anywhere else in the country, but it's still imperfect. If you get stuck on a train, or if the trains aren't running, or if the bus gets a puncture and you give me a ring in good time, then obviously you're not going to get into trouble. Yeah, but what's your penalty for lateness? So eventually he said, well, why? Why do you want to know? And she said, well, I think I'm going to be late quite a lot. Pardon. I think I'm going to be late quite a lot. I find it hard in the mornings. I'm not a mornings person. So I need to know what the penalty... Well, he goes, well, it's a kind of 3 strikes and you're out rule. Certainly during your probation period, if you're late with no good reason, you'll get a warning. And once you've got 3 warnings, we'll probably... And she goes, oh, well, I think I'll leave it then. This probably isn't for me. Who the hell answers that question in the way that she's hoping they're going to answer it? Who says, oh, no, that's fine. We're very relaxed about it. You turn up when you feel like it. So the kitten, the lateness, the disappearing. One of them, as is often the case in retail scenarios, is you're on your feet all day. She comes in lunchtime, second date. I don't know how you do it. So I don't know how you do it. How do you do it all day? My legs are killing me. He's like, well, I'm twice your age. I'm at least twice your age. I've been doing this for 20 years. I can't do it. I'm really sorry. I really thought that. So actually, I can't just accept that it's true, can I? There is a sea change in the relationship that young people think they should have with work. I say this as someone who hates the idea of older people thinking that young people are work shy or lazy or both. I don't think they are work shy or lazy or both, but something quite profound has changed, and I don't understand why. Part of it could be that you have to prove, if you're signing on, and listen, unless you're living at home with your parents and getting all your meals cooked and your laundry done and a 50 quid bung on a Friday night to go out and paint the town red, nobody is living the life of Riley on welfare payments in this country. I don't think anybody ever was. But if you subscribe to that school of thought 10 years ago, I promise you it doesn't exist anymore. So this relationship between expectations and reality fascinates me. And you might occasionally have come across it as a customer or as a client. I think hospitality is really suffering from Brexit, obviously, and from the failure or the inability to put people in these jobs who really, really want to be there. But if you are applying for any form of unemployment benefit, you're now required to prove that you're looking for a job. So there are going to be examples of people who don't really want the job, but in order to carry on receiving their welfare payments, they're going to have to apply for the job. I'm more interested in bosses who can't quite believe what they're dealing with, either with actual employees or potential employees. So you know that the way in which you behaved in your early 20s at work is utterly different from how people in their early 20s, I don't want to say the way that you behaved, your relationship with and expectations of working life. Some of this change is for good. All right, how often, there we go. How often do we talk about pendulums? Or indeed, I think, to be technically correct, pendular. To be pedantic about pendular, I think the plural of pendulum would be pendular, or possibly penduli. How often do we talk about penduli or pendulums on this programme? Answer: a lot. Because my great theory of humanity is that everything is a swinging pendulum. And it starts off way too far over that way. It starts swinging back this way. For about 4 hours on a Wednesday afternoon, everything is perfect. And then the pendulum starts swinging off again in that direction. So some of the progress of this swinging pendulum has been for good. But some of it, I think, is probably for ill, although I'm open to persuasion on that. The idea is that the relationship my generation had with work has disappeared, and the younger generation's relationship with work is profoundly different, and I want to know why. I want to know what has happened to you, and I want to know why things have changed so much. 0345 6060 973. I want to leave you with a different... Well, not leave you. I'm not going anywhere. I'm just waiting for the next hiatus, and then we'll start taking your calls afterwards. The final paragraphs of this article should give you some pause. Underneath it all, I also realised that maybe, just maybe, some of them had a point. Was being the boss of a large corporation really the answer to a life well lived? Was ambition such a great thing? Was working a 10-hour day ultimately going to serve me and my family? These are questions I'm still trying to figure out. So I'll use myself as an example. In my 20s, working in shops, I worked in the bar at college. I worked for River Island. I went to work for Aquascutum. I would always go above and beyond. I'm not bigging myself up. I'm not describing myself as in any way special. If someone asked me to work late, I would. Someone said jump, I'd say how high. It didn't cross my mind that I had much agency. And when I got onto newspapers, I doubled it. When I got onto it, finally started getting shifts on a newspaper, I would do anything that was asked of me. I mean, absolutely anything that was asked of me. And I don't think that's healthy. I don't think things should be like that. I'd get shouted at. I'd get brutalised. Everybody did. I wasn't special. And I rose very quickly in that world. But I don't think it was necessary. Well, I know it wasn't an entirely healthy world. And I was a man. I was a white, straight man. Had I not been any of those three things, my life would have been measurably and demonstrably harder. So I don't want to go back to that. But have things gone a bit too far in the opposite direction? And what is the direction that we're describing? So tell me about why you think the relationship of people 26 and under with work is so completely different from what our relationship was or what your relationship was. And I'll also take examples. I think you'll struggle to beat the kitten. Not literally, won't you? That's not a figure of speech. It sounds a bit like a figure of speech, beating the kitten, but we're not. We are literally talking about a story of a young person who genuinely wanted a job. There's no doubt about that. It wasn't a case of having to prove that you were looking for work, but just presumed that having short notice to care for the neighbour's new kitten would be perfectly reasonable and accommodated by a new employer. That's the mindset I can't get my head around. I want more examples of that. And I want to know why and how it's happened. All right, 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. And if you're feeling really clever today, perhaps you can tell me where the line is. When was that 4 hours on a Wednesday afternoon when the pendulum was in roughly the right place before it started swinging away again and creating in the minds of some young people the idea that the job really just exists entirely for and at their convenience? It's 20 past 12. It's 22 after 12. Okay. I mean, that was a funny introduction. I'm not patting myself on the back because the stories I told you were funny. It doesn't matter who's telling them. Genuinely, a 22, 23-year-old woman applying for a new job, asking whether or not it would be okay to have days off at very short notice because her neighbours have got a new kitten and she has to look after it sometimes. That's just funny, right, to me. But then Nassim sends me a message and it says they are simply not afraid. And I think, well, why was I afraid? I was afraid of not making it, whatever that means. I was afraid of not making it. Still, my anxiety dreams are about that. I don't have anxiety dreams much anymore. I haven't had the one about telling Mick Jagger that I could play the drums and agreeing to play at a charity event 9 months hence and then completely forgetting to have any more drum lessons and turning up at the Abbot Hall on the night of the concert and being pushed onto the stage with my drumsticks. That was one of my anxiety dreams. I don't have the exam anxiety dream anymore, but I still have a newspaper anxiety dream. I'm there and I haven't had a story in the paper for like 10 months and I can't believe nobody's noticed. And as soon as they notice, I'll get fired. And then I wake up and I remember that I'm on the radio now. I'm not a newspaper person, but it's still there. So I was frightened of something. I don't know what. And Nassim says they're simply not frightened anymore. And that's a good thing, right? But then you read this article and he writes about millennials needing constant reassurance and also sort of a sense of promotion, or even if it just meant a fancy job title. But the next generation, the Gen Z or the Gen Z, they just don't seem to have any kind of engagement, as we would once have called it, at all. I want to know why, and indeed what. Owen is in Bournemouth. Owen, what's going on?
Oh, hi, James.
Hello.
I think it's to do with the social contract in a way. I think before, for other generations, there was more of a direct correlation between hard work and knowing that you were going to get something for that. You didn't have to be particularly high achieving to know that by the age of 30, I'm going to be married, I'm going to have the house, I'm going to have a family. The benefits of adulthood that you get from the responsibilities of adulthood. And I'm going to be 24 when I graduate next year, and I look at those three things that I really want to do in my younger days. I have no dreams of going travelling. My dreams are of going straight into a graduate job next summer, and that makes me want to work harder to achieve those things. But I do also have sympathy for the people of my generation who kind of take the opposite approach and just kind of think, honestly, what's the point? Those things are a dream.
I think you're right, and a lot of people. No,
me.
I hear you, and I'm a big fan of the social contract as both a thing and indeed as an answer to complicated questions about social change. But it's about how much better than nothing. Forgive me if I sound like an old git, but surely the real conversation is about whatever you get, how much better than nothing it is, as opposed to how much less than everything. So I completely understand what you're telling me, and who knows if I were 30 years younger, how close I would be to where you are. But if the alternative to something is nothing. So it's the idea that, I'm not bothered about that job if I can't have days off to look after my neighbour's kitten, or if you're going to actually expect me to turn up on time. Is it that a place on the ladder is so much less, or so close to not having anything at all, that you think, well, it's not worth the disruption to actually have anything. I may as well stick with nothing. That's the bit I don't get at my age, Owen. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I don't particularly get it. I get it myself. I'm definitely myself more along your school of thought of thinking.
Right.
Well, those things might be a pipe dream, but I'm certainly going to try as hard.
Yeah, but
as
even
I
if you
can to
don't
make
get
sure
them,
that I
even
get
if you
there.
don't get them, whatever you do at work and however hard you work at work, the more you do and the harder you work, the more you will get. The further you will go, even if you're not going to end up where you thought you were going to end up, or where you would have ended up if you were 20 years older. That's the bit I don't get. It's the what's your penalty for being late? What's your punctuality penalty? Why? Well, because I'm probably going to be late a lot. What? Do you see? No.
Yeah, but maybe that's the reason why people are asking those questions, because if you were in a job where you think, right, if I just get my head down and work hard for 10 years, I'll be where I want to be. But you want to get yourself if you're not particularly high achieving and you don't have those kind of aspirations, you're going to chance your arm at trying to find a role which is going to allow you to get away with not everything, but as much as possible. And you say, where's the line? Well, I think the line is probably the stories that you were describing in the first part of the show, right? Those things are just plainly ridiculous.
But they're plainly ridiculous to you. They're normal for my friends who are employers. Every time I see them, especially the two that I see on their own business premises, as opposed to the two that I see socially, every time I see them, they say, I've got another one for you.
Well, maybe that's just my social circles, because I think I probably know more younger people.
Well, yeah,
than
maybe.
I don't know anyone like that.
And also you're an undergraduate. Maybe the attitudes are still different among undergraduates. I don't know. And these are not. These are jobs with training. These are not just sort of, I don't know what you might call going nowhere jobs. Phil says it's got to be 0-hour contracts. I run a manufacturing company in the Northwest. The staff are now used to agency work. They choose if and when they want to work. The thought of coming to the same place every day is alien to them. It's so difficult to find someone who wants to learn the job. And yet you'd have thought that the security of a permanent job, you offer them that, then the attractions of the flexi time and the 0-hour contract diminish accordingly. I find this fascinating, and I've warned you a few times. It's a conversation we're going to come back to again and again and again, because I find of all the things we talk about together, change is the thing that interests me most, whether it's the ability to change your own mind, whether it is attempting to change other people's minds, whether it is the fascination of people incapable of ever changing their mind, or whether it is tracking the change of the society in which we all live. It is the thing I find most interesting, and I don't get this. I know roughly what it looks like. I accept that some of it is going to do with how big the goals are. What's the point of swinging at that goal if it's disappeared? But it's still going to be better. This is the bit I don't get, is what's the alternative? So you say, I can't take that job because you're not going to let me have time off to look after my neighbour's kitten. Is someone going to say, yes, that's fine? Or is someone going to say, no, you just turn up when you feel like it and just let me know. Do you want to go home now? Yeah, that's fine. What's the what happens after this? Do they just do this for a couple of years and then go, oh, the world doesn't work in quite the way that I thought it did? Or do they find an employer who has special kitten policies, neighbours' kitten policies, or ... It's coming up to 12:30. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Amelia Cox is here now with your headlines. 33 minutes after 12 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I mean, some of these distinctions are a bit fluid, aren't they? Generation Z, Boomer, Generation X. I'm Generation X. And the idea that the boundaries are cast in stone, or that the year in which you were born is going to have a massive influence upon your attitude or opinions, is obviously a little bit silly. But there are broad brushstrokes in play here that can... that I think you can recognise. So when this employer writing for the Daily Mail today draws a distinction between Generation Z and millennials, he does so, I think, quite persuasively. So your millennial would still see the point in progress. Emma laughing at me, and I think probably rightly, for still buying into the idea that the harder you work, the more you will get. You see, there's an example of what intellectual constipation looks like. So, I spend a lot of time mocking or criticising, or when I'm feeling bounteous, trying to help people who can't change their mind about things. The best example, probably, when people used to ring me about house prices and tell me they worked bloody hard to get their first house in 1954. And then when we dig into the numbers, it turned out their first house in 1954 cost roughly 3 times their salary. And you point out to them that today that multiple is likely to be 20 or 30 times their salary. And then you say, so how would you have got a house if the relationship between what you were earning and what you were required to pay was multiplied by a factor of 10 or 20? And so you can finally help people realise it. It works with private education, I've noticed. Nick had a caller today who said that Nick, as in Nick Ferrari, was the only person in the media speaking up for the parents of privately educated children who worry about the introduction of VAT. I thought, my God, I don't know where you live, but you should send the rest of us a postcard. The Daily Mail, the Daily Telegraph, the Times, even the Sun, which you can't imagine is necessarily the paper of choice for many people dropping kids off at St. Olaf's. Everybody, every right-wing outlet in the country is doing what it always does, which is sticking up for the interests of wealth. The notion that the introduction of VAT on school fees is something that the media is encouraging and supporting is a position that, even by the standards of people that ring some radio programmes, it is a position of almost unbelievable absurdity. But it works very well. So if you know people that are worried about the introduction of VAT on their school fees, tell them to eat fewer avocados, or to cancel their Netflix, or indeed to get on their bike, save a few quid that way, get the kids to cycle to school. So you know that it always cuts both ways. But I do think that I might be guilty of that. What would you call it? A kind of stubbornness of thought on this. As in, I can't quite imagine what the world looks like from somebody else's perspective. Of course, the harder you work, the more you get. The harder you work, the faster you go. Still true mostly in my world, but maybe it just isn't true at all for huge numbers of people. So if I'm back at River Island and I'm the kid sticking his hand up and volunteering to do the stock take and volunteering to do this, and then when the manager is coming to look for someone who can maybe take over a new concession or become a head of department, they'd come to me first. But what if what you're earning is so little relatively that there's no point doing it because the difference it's going to make to your life is negligible? I don't know. I'm trying to work it out with your help. Dan's in Reigate. Dan, what made you pick up the phone?
Good afternoon. It's an interesting one, this conversation about generation and work ethic.
I
I'm
hope so,
29.
Dan. I'm doing my
I-
best, mate. I hope it's interesting. That's the holy grail of my profession. Go on, 29.
I'm 29, so I don't know which way you want to stick me in, a millennial or
You'd
Gen
be a
Z or in
millennial on
between.
paper, but I'm more interested in your attitudes compared to what you encounter from people who are probably younger and certainly possessed of different attitudes.
So I've got a plumbing company. There's 8, 9 of us working here. And of the applications we get for the younger generation coming through, it's never the person themselves applying. It's always their parent. Their mum calls up, their dad sends an email. They're not out looking to do a job. They don't want to be a plumber. They don't want to be an apprentice and do what we have to do to get qualified. It's the parents think it's a good job for their child to do, and they try and find the job. So when we, do meet these kids, they don't want to be there. They're just being told to be there. And I think that...
And this is common enough for you to ring in. It's like a theme that you have... Because if it's a one-off, I get it. But this is something you would describe as almost a characteristic of a generation.
Yeah, our biggest issue is finding good, hard-working members of staff to join our team. Obviously, I'm sub-30, so for me, I need members of a similar sort of age, because I find the older generation don't want to be told what to do by the younger generation, especially when I'm paying their salary. So we need to keep our team young, so we have, I say control, but respect within the ranks.
Yeah.
We can't find sub-20-year-olds to join. And that being said, we have obviously got young lads in the firm, and they are very good. They're very hardworking. They are exceptions to the rules. But that being said, I think that's more the parents raising them well and showing them the value of money, and you have to go to work and earn money, and you can buy nice things and go on holiday. Whereas I think now the younger generation, they go on YouTube, TikTok, they watch influencers. You don't need to go to work.
But you do eventually. So I mean, you get your head turned like that for a month, for 6 months, for a year. At the end of a year, and you're not the new Mr. Beast or whoever it may be, then what do you do instead? This is the bit I don't understand. So they're living at home, which is largely the reason my mum and dad are so desperate to get them into a job.
Yeah, I think that's the problem. Is then when they do come out, we don't want to employ that person. They don't want to be there, and then they're back into being another 6 months of trying to be a social media mogul and be paid to do this and travel the world, and they just don't want to go to work. I don't want to.
So what is the life? What? No, mate. This is. Listen, we're obviously generalising, but it's a generalisation that is solid enough to merit the conversation. What is the life that they lead? This is the bit that baffles me. Is it just that it's like they're still at school, so everything is hand up?
I think so. I think the parents have to look after them. If I don't go to work and earn money, I don't pay my mortgage, I don't have a house. That's my punishment. When I lived at home, if I didn't go to work, well, my dad told me to go to work, or I wouldn't have a house to live in. So that was my punishment there, was I had to go to work and pay him rent. But I don't know if that's an attitude that is being carried anymore.
No, but you don't want the whip being cracked. Loz suggests that we're flirting with serfdom because the rewards are now so low. So I don't know.
Life isn't that bad. I mean, houses are expensive, yes, and things are expensive.
More expensive than ever, actually. It's gone up again this month.
I know. My mortgage will tell me that when I remortgage next year. But you have to go to work. I don't think people are being taught the value of money properly.
But how can you not know the value of money?
Because I don't know that answer.
No,
that's something I'll listen to, and somebody else can tell me.
5 year ago, I'd have come after you now like a rat up a drain pipe and accused you of taking the mickey or of being. But I just think it's too commonplace now. These stories are too commonplace to think that it's not indicative of a broader social trend. And there's a generation who have to be kind, they have a really strange relationship with the idea of work. And you at 29 and me at 52 can't quite get our heads around it because we don't fully get what the alternative is.
I don't think it's glamorous enough.
Yeah, but then we sound like, 10 years ago when the talent shows started, or 20 years ago when the talent shows started, and we'd sit here and say everyone thinks they're going to be the next Will Young or the next Gareth Gates or the next Hearsay or whatever. I'm showing my age a bit there, but I don't. I mean, that can't be true, can it, for everybody any more than it was true then? It's such a strange one. Thank you, Dad. You don't do incinerators, do you?
Yeah, sadly we do. They're terrible.
Yeah, they are, aren't they? What if the button is stuck down? Have you ever come across that?
Probably either the button's failed or there's a split in the hose that goes to the bottom of the unit, I think.
So if I replace the hose, I might be all right?
Or the button, one of the two.
How do I replace the button?
It should just be unscrewed, put the hose on, screw back in.
So unscrew from below and then lift it out from above?
Oh, yeah, and then put a new button in there, hose back on the bottom, you should be good to go.
All right. I might get someone in. What would you charge for that?
Where do you live?
West London.
Yeah, you don't want to pay my call-out charge.
What would be a reasonable price there for someone a bit nearer?
In your area, I think it'd probably be £110 plus VAT.
Jeez, I think I'll just go back to using a bin. Thank you, Dan. 12:42 is the time. Don't forget. Well, I say don't forget. How can you not forget? I haven't told you yet. I'm doing a full disclosure live on stage with the wonderful Carol Vorderman. This is part of the podcast series, but this one will be to raise money for Global's Make Some Noise. Well, the best charity I've ever been involved. Well, one of the best charities I've ever been involved with. We'll be doing it live on stage on Monday, the 10th of February, 2025. Full disclosure live. We'll talk to Carol about her incredible career in all corners of the business and perhaps a little bit more than other areas about her new iteration, sort of Vorderman 3.0 as a political activist and, of course, the author of the best-selling book Now What? On a Mission to Fix Broken Britain, which is just been published by Headline. So do get yourself along to this. All proceeds will go to Global's Make Some Noise. You can book your tickets at lbc.co.uk and they only went on sale this morning, so be quick. These projects, I'll tell you briefly, Global's Make Some Noise looks after small charities. So the organisation, it's like an umbrella. And it shelters smaller charities that don't, for example, have a fundraising budget or a marketing budget. They don't, or if they do, it's biscuits because all the money that they raise goes into the work that they do. So you can name 10 charities right now off the top of your head. And the reason why you can name them is because they have advertising and marketing budgets. So because Global has this amazing platform, because we are, radio behemoths, we can somehow, it's like a hack, we can get around that fact by just supporting these smaller charities. So I become, in a sense, the marketing budget. I become the advertising budget. So does Sheila, so do Ben and Tom. We all become the marketing budget to tell you to give money to this charity or to buy a ticket to see me interview Carol Vorderman, which frankly, you'd want to do that anyway, even if I was getting all the cash. And I'm not. It's all going to Global's Make Some Noise, which supports the kind of charities that struggle sometimes to get the support that they deserve. So go to lbc.co.uk to find out more and to buy your tickets. All proceeds will go to Make Some Noise, which exists to make sure that no one is left facing life's toughest challenges on their own. It's coming up to 1:45. It is 12:47. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we continue to sort of quiz the changing reality of a young person's relationship with work. And I think you're right. I think I do underestimate some elements of this story when I kind of don't. Here it is. This is nicely put. I don't think you've entirely grasped the sense of hopelessness, the near certainty that you'll never own a home, that you're just working to survive, and that reaching a point of financial security is a pipe dream. But I do grasp. I think, I obviously am missing something, because when I read that, I think, but what's the alternative? So I don't want that job because you expect me to turn up on time. What are you going to do instead? That's the bit I don't get. And then talking to, was it Dan a moment ago, about all of the people who are applying, trying to get their children into jobs, that their children can't be bothered to apply. I don't know what's changed, but I think a large part of it is going to be the death of aspiration because the rewards have almost disappeared. And if you want to know why, have a look at who got richer over the last 14 years while almost everybody else got poorer. 12:49 is the time. Jake's in Chesham. Jake, what would you like to say?
Hello, yes.
Hello.
I'm 23, to put into context, and I'm in full-time work. I quite agreed with the Daily Mail article, to be honest. I've been through university, did me a whole lot of nothing, but I've done it. The amount of dogma behind working smarter and not harder.
Oh, yeah.
Every student wanted to work smarter, not harder, because it was at your fingertips. You could use your phone or computer or whatnot. Say you're going into a calculus test, It's not just bringing up the last year's ones. You can look up and speak to people who are involved in the system and ask them what they think. Or you can say you're going for a job interview go for a plumbing, like the last caller or caller before last. And you can say, right, well, all you need is the buzzwords. All you need are those key phrases.
So like hacks,
you can look it up and
shortcuts.
Exactly.
Is that new, though? I mean, I think I was like that when I was your age. I'd have been looking for the kind of... I mean, Cliff's Notes, we used to call them. You just revise the précis of the book instead of actually reading the book itself. There's nothing new there.
That's the point. You picked up a book. You picked up a book. That's more than we need to do now.
Well, no, it's just
go on the internet. And
what is on the internet? What is on the internet now was on paper then. It's not quite the kind of sea change that you think it was. ChatGPT, AI, all of. So the concept of graft is So what do they do instead though? So all right, so you try and blag your way through university. You get ChatGPT to write all your essays. You're looking for your hacks, and you come out. And it's this sense of, when I was your age, I needed to find a job.
Yes.
Do your peers need to find a job? Because the sense I'm getting is that somehow, despite being worse off than ever before, they don't need to find a job.
I would agree with that.
But why don't they need to find a job? Stop agreeing with me and enlighten me.
Because it goes back to the internet again. You can put on a cat voice, log onto Roblox, say Skibidi Toilet a couple times, and then you're a millionaire. It makes
but again, 6 months later, you're going to realise that hasn't worked. Do you see what I mean?
That's the point. Then you're looking for the next shortcut. So the next shortcut is, I might buy some NFTs. I might start a Bitcoin trading.
What am I paying? How am I cooking dinner in the meantime, Jake? What am I eating while I'm waiting for all my NFTs to come in?
You get delivery. I have a friend, okay?
But I've got to pay for Deliveroo. It doesn't just arrive because I rang them.
Well, that's the point. You look onto the codes online. It takes 5 seconds.
No way. No. That's one meal.
Every day.
That's what. All right. Where are my clothes coming from? How am I paying my heating bills? How many of your friends, percentage-wise, still live with their mum and dad?
All but me.
Yeah, there it is. So they can do the things that you're describing because they don't have the...
Absolutely.
But then
they're all earning more than me. I've done the worst out. I've done the worst out of everyone. I'm at work right now. I'm hiding from my boss to do it.
Well, there you go. So you're part of the problem, not the solution. You're part of the problem, not the solution, mate. You're shirking live on the radio. Outrageous behaviour. So we're not So your friends who are in work are not the people that we're talking about. We're talking about the people who aren't going to take that job because they're expected to turn up on time, or the people who aren't going to take that job because they've got to look after their neighbour's kitten, or whatever.
They can do it from home because of internet working. So a friend in central London, he works from home in a place called Seagreen, lovely area.
Yeah, well, don't dob your mate in.
No, I won't name him.
I'm not getting the answer that I'm looking for. I'm not getting. I know you don't ring Deliveroo, Liam. I know you don't ring Deliveroo. I'm not that old. You do it. You're flipping heck. But the people you're talking about have got an income. It's the people who seem to be choosing not to get one that I can't quite get my head around. So you touched on them, but then you revealed that your peer group is earning more than you are. So that's not... that's why I love this topic. Because every time you think you've got a little foothold or a handhold on it, it crumbles in your hand. You don't get it. 12:53 is the time. You're listening to James. Thank you, Jake. Get back to work, mate. Seriously. I won't tell anyone if you don't. David's in Edinburgh. David, what do you reckon?
Hi, James. I was listening to catch up, so I might have missed a little bit of the previous conversation, but during your monologue, I heard you talking about it, and I thought, that's me. I've got phone in.
Go on then.
I recently dismissed an employee for pretty much the reasons that we're talking about.
Did her neighbours have a kitten?
Well, no, I could probably echo the kitten story, maybe not beat it.
Go on.
But no, since the 1st of July, which has started, it was about 8, 9, 10, I've lost count, honestly lost count, but there's 8, 9 or 10 different reasons and periods of absence.
Right.
And it ranges from the usual, I'm not well, I've been up sick all night, to other stuff like that.
So that's 3 months. That's just 3 months, July to September. End of September.
Yeah, 3 months. When they started, she told me she had a pre-booked holiday, which was fine. That was okay. She had jury duty again. That was fine. That was known about. But after the jury duty, that's when it the things started happening. So she was okay for about a week, and then that's when the excuses started to come. When she was on holiday, she messaged me while she was on holiday saying, we're just going to stay another couple of days. Can I use some extra holidays? And at that point, I was like, well, how do I go about this? Do I put the foot down now?
So this is perfect. Because and this is, in her mind, that's an absolutely acceptable and normal way to behave. And fair play. Yeah. But to you and to me, that's almost unbelievable.
Yeah.
Because how do they think the workplace works if people are just going to turn up when they feel like it?
No, exactly. I let it slide. And because she's my first employee, I'm a little bit inexperienced, if I'm in all honesty, because when it comes to payroll, so my accountant deals with that.
Yeah.
And come the end of the month, with all the absences off, I'd left it too late, so the accountant had already processed her payroll at full pay, and I had a discussion with her, and I said, look, messed up the payroll, I haven't deducted anything, here's your full pay, promise me we'll screw the nut for next month. Yeah. And it didn't happen.
She took more time off again.
Yeah.
And how did you let her go? Is that the first time you've hired someone? What can I ask what business you're in? You don't have to tell me. I'm just curious. I'm just nosy, to be honest. No, you don't. That's fine.
Motor trade.
Okay, the motor trade. How did you let her go? Can we do some role play? How did you do it? How did you break the
email
news?
By email. I had an email in a letter because when she was off, I was asking her if she could come in. To see, etc. She kept promising she'll be in on Monday and then in on Tuesday, and eventually it got to the stage where what can I do here? I've got no choice. She's still within her probation period.
Yeah, so you've got to let her go.
Yeah, the way that I kind of.
How did she take it? Did she reply to the email?
No, all she did, she said, well, I get paid for last month for the 3 days that she was in, and I said, yeah.
Even though technically she owes you.
Yeah, because she's taking the holidays. So technically, if we're converting it into wages, it's about 400 quid she owes me.
It's a funny one, isn't it?
So I'm still conflicted about it because it wasn't until she knew that there was a serious threat of her losing her job. That's when she started to open up. And at that point, the decision was already made. She came out with the anxiety and depression, etc. But that wasn't until the day before. And that's where the conflict comes from, James, because I want to help her.
But you've got one employee. You've got one employee. Yeah. If they're not there, your business is operating at 50% capacity.
Yeah, exactly.
But equally, and all good employers would want to accommodate illness, whether it's physical or mental. But if she's just saying, I'm not coming in. And also, the holiday bit, that's got nothing to do with anxiety or mental health. I don't think. No. It's like you're on holiday. No. You've been in the job a month, and you think, I'm just going to drop my boss a note and ask if I can stay on holiday for a bit longer.
Yeah.
I never imagine if I did that now. I'm 52.
The thing as well, James, is I found, I don't know for certain, but pretty sure that she didn't, because I've seen a post on social media of her on the plane, or, they've had people take pictures out the plane window. Yeah. I've seen that, and that was the day that she was supposed to come back originally. So I don't
she was just looking, it's a tight... Well, you highlight the complication of it, but also the reality of the scenario, how much the world... What if you'd said yes? If you'd said, yeah, go on, stay on holiday for another few days, or at least take a few more unscheduled days off. I can't imagine that things would have got better the following month. David, thank you. You sound like a lovely bloke, mate. And clearly it's not an easy thing for you to do. I never trust the people for whom it is easy to let people go. But I suspect that you can't really run a successful business without having a little touch of... I don't want to say ruthlessness, but robustness perhaps would be a better way of putting it, as indeed Keir Starmer has demonstrated apparently with his treatment of Sue Gray. The right-wing media, in case you hadn't noticed, very desperate for you to get furious about this. And if you are very furious about it, name 2 Downing Street Chiefs of Staff. Go on, do it now. What? You can't? And yet the Daily Mail and the Daily Telegraph and various people in my industry have told you that this is Armageddon. This is the end of civilized. Go on, name 2 Chiefs of 2 Downing Street Chiefs of Staff. I'll give you a chance from the last 100 years. Isn't that funny? It's almost like the people that brought you Brexit, Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, austerity and the rest of it are still blowing smoke up your backside. That's it from me for another day. We will be doing it again tomorrow morning from 10. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, where, as David just demonstrated, you can also pause and rewind live radio as well as listen to a range of podcasts. Download it now for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Coming up at 4 on LBC, it's Tom. But now it's Sheila Fogarty.